Okay, who's ready for story time in the barn? I really wanted to do this yesterday because my hair was fixed and my makeup was done and all of that business. But anyway, this is more like real life. So this is what you'll get today. So I just wanted to tell a little story about sensory processing disorder. And I know you're probably wondering, what in the world does that have to do with livestock or showing livestock or anything like that? But I promise I'm going to connect the two things. Just give me a minute. So, my son, who we affectionately call Bub or Bubba, 2 months after he was born, I started having a little bit of concern about him. He was just, I was holding him, he was acting completely normal, but he had goosebumps all over his body. I looked at my mom and I said, he has goosebumps. What in the world? And it wasn't, he was born in September, so it was probably November-ish. We were in the house. It wasn't like cold or anything. And she said, well, do you think he could have a fever? And so I took his temperature, and sure enough, he had like 102 fever. Never cried, never acted like anything was wrong. I took him to the doctor the next morning. He had a double ear infection. And this being my second child, I knew, when my oldest had an ear infection, dude, she was sick and throwing up and like all the things. So that was my first time where I was like, this is strange. Like he should be acting like he doesn't feel good. Then when he would get his shots, he wouldn't cry. He'd be sitting on my lap, and he was a chubby little thing, and they would stick his leg with the needle, and he would just kind of look at him like, what? And everybody was always just like, oh my gosh, he's so tough. He's going to be a football player and all. And I would just be like, yeah, but I remember thinking, okay, but isn't that like something I should be concerned about, that he's not crying when he gets poked or hurt or whatever? And so those were my first couple of things that really like made me go, something's not right. Then as he started going into school, actually before he went into school, he was in preschool and I worked where he went. I started noticing that like he wasn't crossing the midline. And if you don't know a whole lot about brain development, then that's not going to make any sense to you. But so he would, like, if, for example, he would be writing on a piece of paper, he would start with his left hand with the crayon or whatever, and he would go to the middle of the page with his left hand, and then he would switch to his right hand. And so, like, if he was painting on an easel or whatever he was doing, the left side of it he would do with his left hand, and the right side of it he would do with his right hand. So that was when I really started going, something's going on here. By the time he was in pre-K, he hadn't picked a dominant hand. He really was struggling with some fine motor stuff. All of that, to long story kind of shortened, I went to a training for a big national conference and heard about sensory processing disorder, which back then was called sensory integration dysfunction. Things have come a long way since then. There wasn't a whole lot of information about it out back about 20 years ago. And they were really putting it with autism. It wasn't kind of its own separate thing back then. And so it was really hard to get anybody to know what I was talking about or to get help for him around here, because when I would say sensory integration issues, they were like, okay, nobody really knew what the heck I was talking about. And so I just kind of had to figure all that out on my own with him. And so a little bit about sensory processing. A lot of times people will have hypersensitivities and hyposensitivities. And so like Bub had both. For instance, brushing his teeth, it was like you were torturing him when he had to brush his teeth. It literally, like, for him, he registered it as pain. Also getting his hair cut, oh gosh, I have a picture of him just crying, getting his first haircut, and it was because that it hurt him. Like, that's how his body, how we would just register it as like something kind of going over our head or whatever. His brain registered that as pain. It was actually painful for him. But then on the flip side of that, he had a lot of hyposensitivities to where, for instance, like his fine motor, if you can imagine having a pair of gloves on and trying to do all the things you have to do in school with a pair of gloves on. So like writing, when they're small and they're doing like manipulative type games or whatever. He hated the riding area, hated it, would not go to the riding area because it was just really frustrating for him. I don't want to get too like involved in all the brain development stuff because I can totally geek out on all of that. But basically his proprioceptive sensory stuff is kind of off. And so to sum it up, it's kind of like for him, he's not super aware of where his body's at in relation to everything else around him. And so when he was little, he loved to be cuddled. He loved to be held all the time. Whenever I train people who are working in early childhood, I tell them this story just to tell them like he could have easily been labeled as a kid who was spoiled because he liked to be held and he loved to be cuddled all the time. But truth be told, that was something he needed, not something he wanted. So for his proprioceptive sensory input, he needed to be cuddled a lot and held a lot and have a lot of sensory input. Where the livestock showing comes into play for Bub is that it took him a long time, a very long time, to really understand where he was at in the ring, where he was at in conjunction to his calf, how to stand, it just took years longer for him to grasp that than it did a lot of other kids. But it's been such a good thing for him to do because, for one thing, talk about sensory input, messing with a big giant heifer gives you some sensory input into your world. I mean, as silly as it might sound, like rinsing and brushing and the weight of the animal just in the lead, pulling them and getting them to do what you need them to do. It was all a lot of good sensory input for him, and just being outside and being in the barn. And so also the other side of it too is the livestock showing business is a lot about how hard you're willing to work at it. It's not just about do you have that natural talent. Our youngest daughter and our oldest daughter, both of them actually had a pretty natural showmanship to them. They could walk out in a ring with an animal and look really dang good with it. The first time we put her in a show ring, she just looked like she'd been doing it, for years and years. And poor Bub did not have that going for him. So there wasn't necessarily that natural ability for him. But the coolest thing for me is, even though as his mom, like, I knew, gosh, am I going to get emotional every time I do one of these? I knew watching him out in the show ring how much harder he had to work just to walk his calf into place, just to be set up the right way, just to make sure he wasn't digging that show stick in too hard, because he has a hard time understanding like the pressure that he's putting on things. I knew that as his mom. I knew how hard he was working, but everyone else around didn't really necessarily see that. But what they did see in him, in over the years of watching Bub show, they saw this kid who wasn't always winning. As a matter of fact, if you lay it out, his whole show career, the number of times he won going in the ring versus the number of times he did not, the did nots far outweigh the wins. But he never, ever once quit. And he would take a heifer that was not very good, and he would work every bit as hard with that heifer that wasn't very good as he would with a heifer that, was going in the ring and knocking it out of the park. Like, it didn't matter to him. He had this work ethic, and he just doesn't have any quit in him. And there were a couple of years where things were pretty rough for him, and as far as just not really doing much. And everybody around just watched that, though. And I know that his work ethic and his willingness to do whatever it takes, his willingness to work hard, his willingness to never give up on something, is something that over the years, as he grew into, an older teenager, people took notice of that, and people could see that in him, even if they didn't understand the full story of how much harder he was working than they probably even knew, they did see in him. And I think that the fact that he had to always work so hard at everything created in him this thing where it wasn't a big deal to him if he had to work harder than everybody else. He's always been working harder than everybody else, and that's just who he is. And so, man, his senior year, and just I could sit here and have an hour long conversation about this, and I know nobody wants to sit and listen that long, but just as his mom and all the things that went into bringing him up and trying to make sure he was okay and trying to give him every modification he needed in school to make sure that he was successful, and all the things, watching him his senior year do amazing in the show ring was so cool. I mean, that was obviously that's what we want. We want our kids' senior years to be amazing. But the coolest part to me is the audience when he won Reserve Grand at our county show, which was a big deal for us. We're not, I mean, for some people that's not a big deal. For us, that was a big deal. The crowd was just like listening to all these people clap for him, and all these parents come up to me afterwards and just talk about how happy they were for him. Listen to me. That's what got me, because I know that all these people watched him his whole life, and they watched him just work so hard at it and never give up. And then the coolest part is he'd won a couple little showmanships here and there, but showmanship was tough for him. We were just kind of like in shock his senior year about him reserving the whole show. So my husband and I are just kind of like, whew, sitting in the background. He went back in the ring for showmanship, and we just weren't even paying that close of attention, which is crazy. I mean, it was his senior year. It was his last county showmanship. They don't do showmanship at a regional district show. And so we're just kind of back there just catching our breath, like, whew, this has been crazy. And he goes back in for showmanship and wins showmanship. He won senior showmanship, and that's a big deal. That was a big deal to go from this kid who had a hard time even understanding where to stand in the ring and how to make his calf look like it needed to. I mean, even in his later years, there were a couple of times that we had to be like, Bub, you were set up diagonal. And he's like, no, I wasn't. And we had to show him the picture and be like, you were. You had the calf set up diagonally. So to see him win showmanship, that his senior year was just amazing. He's got a scholarship to go to a junior college. Not based on his academics, not based on his natural raw talent that God gave him, but based on his personality, and based on the fact that there were these people that saw how hard he was willing to work and gave a good recommendation for him to go to college and to be, just to be able to say about him, he's going to work hard for you. The jobs and the different places it's taken him, just because people have seen in him his work ethic. And so as hard as it was to watch a kid struggle with sensory processing disorders in his early years, it's been really amazing to see what it's created in him, even though it was a bad thing. It was a scary thing when he was little. It was something I worried about and fretted over and prayed about. Now I look at it and go, man, that created this kid who just absolutely has no quit in him. And so it's a neat thing to look at the way God molds our kids. And it's hard to watch sometimes. It's hard to watch the molding part, because it's painful sometimes. But then when you see the end results of it, and you're like, oh, I see what you were doing there. That's the cool part. So anyway, if anybody wants to know anything else about sensory processing disorders and some of the interventions that are out there and things that we tried, and I am more than happy to talk about that, but I know most of you are just here to talk about the livestock showing biz. So that's where that came into play for that kiddo of mine, and part of the reason I'm so incredibly thankful for this industry and the fact that even though I have my two younger kids who aren't ever going to be academic superstars because they both have some struggles in school, they have this other thing that they can be super successful at based on how hard they're willing to work at it, based on outworking other people, you know, being willing to do the things other people aren't willing to do at home and on the sidelines. They have that thing that, you know, allows them to really feel rewarded for their hard work, not necessarily rewarded for their regular bill. And I'm not saying academics doesn't take, listen, I was the academic kid growing up. Like, I worked really hard at it, but also some of it came really easy to me, and school came really easy to me. So it wasn't necessarily something I feel like I can be like, I worked so much harder than everybody. When I look back now and realize there were kids around me who were working way harder than I was and not making the grades that I was because they had their own struggles they were dealing with. And so having these other things that are available to children and making sure they're as important, you know, in the academic setting as anything else is important, I feel like, because this is going to be what my son does for the rest of his life. He will be working with cattle. He will be doing something in the ag industry. So I'm so thankful that he had an ag program that supported him and helped him to feel successful in school. So it's a big reason I feel like we've got to keep supporting our ag programs in the schools. So, all right, that's all. This is a long one. I'm sorry. I told myself I was going to keep it under 10 minutes, and that absolutely didn't happen. So thanks if you've made it through this whole video.